So for this video, I want to talk a little bit about one of your key assignments for HCOM 437. You're going to be writing a series of brief analysis essays, and in these essays, you're going to be doing a close reading or a close textual analysis of different texts from Shakespeare's canon. So we've got the poems, the sonnets that we start the course with, and then we move into the comedies and the tragedies. And I'm going to be doing a demonstration of a brief analysis today using Sonnet 85. And before I do that, I want to review the directions that you have when you write your own analysis. And so you'll find the directions in our course website, and you'll see that in a well-organized essay, you are to identify and analyze a literary technique Shakespeare uses to illuminate a particular theme in your selected text. And as I said, you're going to be starting with an analysis of a sonnet, just as this demonstration will show. So that idea of explaining a theme is critical for this assignment, that you want to get at some kind of meaning, that this is really about both the how, so what are the writerly choices that Shakespeare has made, and also what is the message about life, about human experience, about relationships, about identity, about art, for instance, that Shakespeare is conveying through those rhetorical and literary choices that he's made. I'm asking you to choose a particular device, such as character foil, imagery, extended metaphor, paradox, characterization, and in the analysis that I'm going to be modeling for you with Sonnet 85, you'll see it's all about the presentation of the sonnet's speaker, so the persona or the ethos, kind of the speaking voice in the sonnet, the identity that Shakespeare creates, and how the particular language choices suggest kind of an ironic self-fashioning at work in Sonnet 85. You're not required to cite secondary sources for the brief analyses. You will later on when you do your longer paper at the end of the course. But your close reading should be informed by some of the scholarly readings that we have for HCOM 437. And again, in this demonstration, you'll see that I'm working with just the primary text itself, really going in quite closely. You'll have lots and lots of direct quotations in a brief analysis. When we work with literature, the evidence itself is the language. It's the words, phrases, sentences on the page. If you were in another discipline, you might do more paraphrase or summary of the text that you're reading, because the language itself is not the subject of study. But with a literary analysis, lots of direct quotations, because that's the material that we are analyzing. That, as I said, would be our data. Because these essays are so brief, it's essential for you to really focus in on a very specific kind of device and meaning. And you'll see that in my brief analysis, it's all focused on the representation of the speaker. So you'll also want to make sure that you take a look at the rubric for the analytical essays, both for writing your brief analyses and then also for writing the longer paper at the end of the course. You'll notice it's a 6-point rubric. 6 means exceptional, 5 is commendable, 4 is adequate, 3 is limited, and 2 and 1 represent serious difficulties meeting the requirements of the assignment. So a 6 paper, essays earning a score of 6 are especially well developed, subtle, and stylistically elegant. These essays effectively analyze the way Shakespeare creates meaning in his text, and I'm reading from the rubric that you have access to in our course website. They present complex interpretations. The language of these essays is precise and focused, and so that idea of real attention to the writing itself, to your own meaning-making strategies, so not just the how and the what of the text that you're analyzing, but in those top essays, in the A+ essays, I'll be able to see that you were also paying attention to kind of your how and your what and your why, and that you are writing rhetorically in clean and maybe occasionally elegant academic prose. So you're going to have a demonstration of maybe how to do that with my brief analysis of William Shakespeare's Sonnet 85. As you listen to the paper, and you're going to be listening to it, and I'll tell you, I'm reading off of a teleprompter, so I haven't memorized this paper. If you go to an academic conference, if you go on into grad school, for instance, and you go hear panels on Shakespeare sonnets, maybe at the Modern Language Association, you'll notice that scholars read their papers. They're not going to be doing PowerPoint presentations. They pay careful attention to the written word itself, the power of the written word. You'll notice people in the audience take notes, and so they're doing very attentive listening to try to capture a sense of the structure and the content and the argument of the papers that they're hearing. So I would suggest that you do the same thing. See if you can figure out both what I'm saying, so what is my argument, what is this all about, and also how am I making my argument? How do I use evidence? Can you tell where I have introduced direct quotations? Which quotations are a little bit longer? Where am I quoting just a single word or a short phrase? What about my transitions? Can you tell where there's a turn? Do I ever kind of lead you in one direction only to do a shift and take you somewhere else? So that to really follow my claims, you have to listen all the way to the end, right? I might be misleading you a little bit. And as I've already kind of tipped my hand and said, I'm writing about a contrast here, and that there is something surprising and really interesting about the persona, the speaker that Shakespeare creates in Sonnet 85. So kind of look for those twists and turns in the development of the argument. It's a good idea to create a T-graph, so actually divide your paper into two different columns. On the one side, record the key claims and evidence, so that would be the what, and on the other side, record the how, so that would be the transitions that I use, the stylistic choices, see if you can figure out rhetorically what I'm doing, as well as in terms of content, in terms of my thesis, what I'm saying. So here's the paper itself. This is titled Identity Inverted by Jennifer Fletcher. The speaker in William Shakespeare's Sonnet 85, "My tongue-tied muse in manners hold her still," appears at first to be a quiet and humble character who cheerfully accepts his inability to poetically praise the young man he admires. However, as the light tone of the poem gives way to a subtly mocking one, the speaker's second identity emerges as a poet superior in his sincerity, who attacks the superfluous language of his rivals. Through the contrast between the rich and almost materialistic language that Shakespeare uses to describe the rival's poetry and the simplicity of the speaker's tone, Shakespeare creates a double identity for his speaker as both faulted and superior that ultimately serves as a metapoetic comment on the excellence of Shakespeare's own works. Throughout the first 9 lines of Sonnet 85, Shakespeare makes reference to the speaker's presumed inability to express himself. He writes of, quote, tongue-tied muse, end quote, that prevents the speaker from writing in comparison to the profuse amount of poetry generated by other poets. They are, quote, by all the muses filled, end quote, and profusely praise the young man's virtue. Shakespeare further describes the speaker's lack of written means for demonstrating his esteem of the young man in line 5, as the speaker says, quote, I think good thoughts, while others write good words, end quote. In the following 2 lines, the speaker assumes the voice of a religious supplicant, humbly conceding his ignorance concerning the manner of worship appropriate to his deity. The speaker says that he, quote, like the unlettered clerk, still cry, Amen, to every hymn that able spirit affords, end quote. By using the biblical reference to an educated man who affirms religious tenets of whose meaning he is ignorant, the speaker characterizes himself as a man who not only cannot produce eloquent poetry, but who does not even understand it. The most the speaker can do by way of praising the young man, it seems, is to agree with those more inspired writers by commenting, "'Tis so, 'tis true," in line 9. However, as the focus of the sonnet shifts to the sincerity of the speaker in line 10, Shakespeare begins to cast doubt on the notion that the speaker is genuinely inferior to his rivals. The 10th line of the sonnet, quote, "and to the most of praise add something more," end quote, seems paradoxical if utmost written praise is taken as the highest honor that can be given anyone. The speaker subtly suggests that it is not. He states in lines 11 and 12 that his thoughts are more powerful than mere rhetoric and more accurately reflect the depth of his love. Words have a less honored position in the speaker's mind and, quote, come hindermost, end quote. The speaker then further challenges the elevated status of the rival poets by suggesting a certain superficiality in their, quote, breath of words, end quote, as if their praise was only so much dissipating wind. Conversely, the speaker's show of admiration is much more concrete and substantial. He shows his thoughts in action, speaking an effect, to quote Shakespeare. By the end of the sonnet, Shakespeare has infused a subtle tone of irony in the phrase, dumb thoughts, in the final line, and the speaker no longer seems to be self-reproaching. Upon a second reading of the poem, even the tongue-tied muse of the opening line is an image that works to the speaker's credit when regarded as an example of his well-mannered restraint in the company of so much glib obsequiousness. Shakespeare has clearly set up this reversal in status of his speaker to accentuate the contrast between him and the rivals. Whereas the reader's admiration for the speaker grows throughout the poem, his or her respect for the poetic rivals conversely diminishes, bringing about an identity of the speaker that is characterized in proportion to his rivals' faults. One of the ways in which Shakespeare critiques the rival poets is through an emphasis on the ornate language of their poetry. The sonnet is filled with diction referring to superficial beauty. In lines 2, 3, and 4, Shakespeare uses words such as richly, golden, and precious to describe the writings of the rival poets on the young man's character. These three terms all allude to a monetary or decorative quality about the poet's work that hint at them being too elaborately written. There is an implication of superfluous insincerity in the excessive descriptions of the rival's poems. The, quote, polished form of well-refined pen, end quote, in line 8, becomes almost a metonymous symbol for the cultured but superficial rivals of the speaker. The pen itself seems to have an essentially ornamental quality in their hands, and there is an implication that the graceful script of the poets is for appearances only. The emphasis on words associated with material riches is also a stark contrast to the religious characterization the speaker gives himself as an, quote, unlettered or uneducated and hence unworldly clerk, in line 6. Through the simplicity of his tone, as seen in the cheerfully bland, "'Tis so, 'tis true," the speaker is also posited as being more credible and grounded than the rivals. His gentle accusation in the final couplet is that his rivals are not nearly as substantial as himself. The extent to which Shakespeare's own voice as a poet emerges in Sonnet 85 can be seen from a metapoetic reading of the poem. Clearly, there is a problem with Shakespeare assuming the voice of someone who cannot write and then expressing it so perfectly in a written medium. Shakespeare resolves this problem by creating the double identity of the speaker. The humble ingenue serves to express Shakespeare's own earnest attempt to remain sincere in his writing, while the superior speaker allows Shakespeare a sly attack on overblown language, similar to the mocking critique Shakespeare makes in Sonnet 130, the famous poem that begins, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." The addressee of the poem, the young man, virtually makes no appearance at all, and it is questionable whether the sonnet is even directed at him. It is more likely that the sonnet is targeted at the, quote, others of line 13, Shakespeare's poetic rivals, and the mock humility of the poem makes its tone somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Ultimately, Shakespeare's Sonnet 85 is an ingenious piece of self-presentation. It poses as a poem of meek dispraise that is inverted to a cleverly constructed form of self-praise. Through the contrast between the simple tone of the speaker and the elaborate language used to describe his rival poets, Shakespeare skillfully creates a double identity for his speaker that is defined through opposition to his rivals, and that effectively establishes himself as a master of the poetic form. Thank you.